They now need to take that funding and go and execute. But there's a real market driver there in terms of the need, as we've described, and this gives them the resources to go and address that.
Hello, you're watching Proact. I'm joined by Neil Crabb, the CEO of Frontier IP Group. Neil, good to speak with you today. Your portfolio company, 2D Photonics, has been awarded a €200 million grant in Italian state aid. That's to accelerate developments and scale up its advanced graphene photonics. Can you start by telling us more about 2DP's technology?
Yes, certainly. So there's been a move in infrastructure to use photonics rather than electronics to move data around. And the reason is basically that you can get more data through a fiber optic system than you can through an electronic system. People will be familiar at this at home with, for example, probably having fiber now to their home rather than having a cable for their internet provision. Well, the same is true at infrastructure at a chip level. And the challenge within that, though, is that silicon is reaching the end of its ability to deliver continuous performance improvements year on year. It's at its physical limits. Graphene as a material is super interesting because it can cope with a wider bandwidth of light. It uses less energy and it is less temperature sensitive, so it needs less cooling. So all of those things say that it potentially can allow the rate of improvement that we need to see ongoing, which is not available with pure silicon technologies. And this at a time when obviously there's an explosion of interest in data centers, in large language models and such like, that is putting huge pressure on compute cost and the ability to bring that down and process more data compared to what was previously required.
Tell us more about the grant, please.
Yeah, so in terms of adoption, whenever you introduce a new material to the semiconductor industry, you need to demonstrate that you can make it work at scale. So this money from the Italian government, but approved by the European Union under the state aid regulations, is to enable a pilot plant to be built that will demonstrate large-scale manufacturing at 200 millimeters, so an 8-inch wafer. And that is the route both to service a significant market directly, but also to enable adoption of the technology later by the really big semiconductor companies to put this new material into their existing manufacturing plants. So it's part of that scale-up journey. It's not just, research. This is actually to get to the point where this can be deployed at scale within industry.
Neil, what does this mean for Frontier IP?
Yeah, so we own 9.1% of 2D. We already have as co-investors Sony, Bosch, NATO, the Italian Sovereign Wealth Fund, CDP. So it's got really good institutional backing. This lets it go to the next stage of really large-scale rollout. Just from a purely financial point of view, if you took the grant and said, what's that worth in per share terms? So it's not our cash, but if you just said, what's the grant worth in per share terms, mapping it back to Frontier, it equates to about 22p per share in Frontier. So if you just say the grant divided times the percentage we own, divided through by the number of Frontier shares, divided by the euro to sterling exchange rate, it comes out at about 22p, which gives a feel for the scale of the importance of this level of support for one of the portfolio companies. Obviously, they now need to take that funding and go and execute. But there's a real market driver there in terms of the need, as we've described, and this gives them the resources to go and address that.
Right, Neil, what else is happening at your portfolio companies?
Yeah, so I think Alusid, obviously, we've seen ongoing progress. There have been a number of announcements we put out about that. I know you've interviewed them here on the channel as well, so people can go and look at that. But they are moving towards going public on the basis of their European rollout, where they've got a number of partners have been signed up and are beginning to deploy more ranges coming through as well. Pulsiv, we're seeing really strong progress driven by a range of European legislation that is essentially making the technology more appealing to deploy now, because the EU is tightening up on everything from the type of connector to how efficiently it performs, both from a temperature and electrical noise point of view, and that really gives a strong competitive advantage to Pulsiv. So people should expect to see more news on that. I would just flag, I know lots of investors have been interested and poised to see what happens there next. As has been shown with 2D, these things do take time to come through, but that's because we're trying to get them deployed at European or global scale, and there just is a timescale to these. It's frustrating on deep tech, but that's the nature of the process. So absence of news is not news of absence. I think there's a strong potential to come through there. GraphEnergyTech is super interesting with what's happening as well. Obviously, we've got Aramco as a backer there. The silver price, as investors will know, has been going through the roof, and their ability to replace the silver that's used in solar panels with graphene in a form of carbon clearly has a much more compelling competitive advantage, cost advantage now than previously. We saw great results from TVG not so long ago on its first animal studies in certain diseases, and again that should map towards moves with commercial partners as well. So we think that's very exciting. So there's a range of activity, CRI rolling out. It's got some interesting technology also that is applied to looking at things like nanoplastics, which again people will be reading about regularly and how those are measured in the environment. Also looking at its application in the pharmaceutical industry, and these are big growth markets across the portfolio. I would say, clearly we're facing challenging economic times, as people will be aware, but we have a very strong emphasis on technologies that reduce cost as well as delivering innovation. And I think if there is a silver lining to the present uncertainty, it's that cost story is even more resonant than it was previously. There's also I would say, a technology sovereignty story that is running, that the EU and UK are thinking much more clearly about technologies that can be domiciled geographically here. And I mentioned the Italian sovereign state, for example, being an investor in 2D versus China, or even to some degree the US. There's an understanding of the need for innovation to be based within a territory rather than just used within a territory. And I think, again, that's going to be an underlying driver of progress in the portfolio.
Well, Neil, thank you very much for the update today. I hope we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Neil Crabb, the CEO of Frontier IP Group.